Are you prepared to be unpopular and to make unpopular decisions? Are you prepared for people to gossip about you and tell you that either you're incompetent or you're cruel? I think they more fail because they're not willing to have hard conversations.
The joke is like everybody wants to be a leader, but nobody wants to lead.
Truer words have never been said.
Hey folks, welcome to Season 2, Episode 4 of Fun BMC. Today we are talking to the startup Bond, Suzan Bond. Welcome, Suzan.
Hi, thanks.
Suzan has a career coaching or startup leadership coaching business. And she herself has been a C-level exec at a growing startup. So we want to hear some stories about that, of course. And then I think in general, there's a lot of attention being paid to founder mental health, I think is the right term. And as a founder, I've gone through the ups and downs myself and working with a lot of founders. There's a lot of stories that we don't share because, for whatever reasons. I want to start with my standard 3 questions. And again, this can take 30 seconds each, 3 minutes each, whatever you feel comfortable with. But number 1 is who you are. Number 2 is what you do. And number 3 is why do you do it?
Perfect. So who am I? I'm Suzan Bond. I'm a leadership coach. I focus specifically these days on leaders at startups and scaling startups, both founders and non-founders. And I actually think there's a lot of interesting stuff about the relationships. And I'm a former COO, and I've been in the tech world well over 15 years in all sorts of phases. So that's who I am and what I do. I think I already did part of that. I'm a leadership coach, and I focus specifically on more senior leaders. I think there's we can talk about what a lot of people consider leaders at the management level. I think about people who are working across the organization, not just down and up, but they're really having to work across, which is any sort of founder. Founders always have to be figuring that out. And then why do I do what I do? My background is in psychology and sociology, and I don't think we talk about those things enough. And I often think that the failures in business at scaling startups, obviously product market fit is massive, right? That's a massive issue. But aside from that, I think we often think the problems are technical, and I actually think they're more relational. They're intrapersonal, which is the relationship with ourselves. They're interpersonal, our relationship with others, or they're organizational, which is how the org is working at its own.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, which is I've worked with a lot of startups through their growth phase. And I think a lot of organizational issues that we see years down the line start as kind of founder interpersonal or intrapersonal relationships. It just takes years and years to build out or to
Right.
itself.
It's like building, and then you're like,
Yeah. I saw
that's...
that. I knew that was going to happen. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, it's unfortunate, but it's the same patterns repeated. And after 2 decades, you do start to see the kind of same stories being repeated. But I think the thing you said earlier was really interesting, which is leadership is not just the founders, right? It's founders and non-founder leadership in these startup organizations. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because if we think about leaders as if all leaders are the same and it's like the leaders against, in not healthy organizations, leaders against the rest of us, right? But I think there's a way in which what we need to talk about is that there is a whole dynamic going on at the leadership level as well. And founders and leaders who join the team who don't have a stake in the business actually have different motivations, which is not bad, it's just different. They have different levels of power and control and influence. There's a whole lot of dynamics at play there. And I think there's something interesting to just even name that there are still power dynamics and differences in the relationships at the most senior levels. Because I think when we don't name it, we just sort of assume, and then we make a lot of bad assumptions, and we miss over things like implicit decision making that happens because, they're a founder, so we're going to defer to them. Even though we say the decision making happens like this, and you have this title. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, it does, because even something as simple as going into meetings, and you could have a team meeting or all hands meeting or whatever, and everybody's looking at the founders to kind of see what they are doing and their reaction, it could be a nonverbal communication, right? You could be out presenting something. Here's a new product launch. Here's whatever. And the founder's just standing there like, and everybody in the room is sort of like paying attention to that, right? There's a lot of power dynamics and things like that. Can you talk about your experience working as a COO, or were you the founder of, I think, Travis CI, or were you brought in? I think that's kind of, that leader but non-founder role.
Yeah, so I was a non-founder at that company. I was brought in after the company had been going for quite a while. It was in the scaling phase. And I would say our exec team was at that point maybe like half founders, half not, which was super interesting. It was very balanced. And I think that we were aware, which was really great about the founders I worked with, was we were aware of those kind of potential dynamics. And it's more about the non-founder saying, oh, but it's not my business, or do I have authority to speak up? Or what if I disagree? Does my opinion matter? And, I don't necessarily hear that from the founders, but like also the dynamic of what if you're not a founder, do you step back in your own leadership rather than speaking up and being confident and thinking I have something interesting that they hired me for, that I bring a different viewpoint that might be actually really valuable.
Yeah, I think that's really important, especially in a COO role, assuming there's people, an organization. How do you build a structure around that? And I think some of that work usually falls upon the founders. But at this stage of, we're saying scaling stage of most startups, that's when you bring in the execs. That's when you bring in the experienced people. And in some cases, the folks in the room that are there to do the work because they've done it before and almost guide the founders in some ways, right? Like that's what the investors want. They want to make sure their investment is, taken care of.
Well, yeah, and you bring up an interesting dynamic too, like what happens in founders as the business kind of outgrows them, or it changes to a degree. And do they recognize, can they grow with the company, or does it change to a way that where they need to step aside? So I think there's also dynamics in there too around, do they recognize when the business has outgrown them and they're no longer fit for the same role?
Yeah. So in my normal business, I don't know which is my real business, which is my side hustle, but I've been doing, startup recruiting for companies for like over 10 years. And a lot of that is making sure the match is not just the right person for the company, but at their stage in their life and the company's stage, and whether they can grow together. And if they can't grow together, like even if I hire somebody great and the company takes off and they can't keep up, they're going to be out. And I think the hardest one is actually the founders, because it's really hard for them to admit, hey, maybe I'm not cut out for this. Maybe I'm not the scaling person.
They've been nurturing this. It's hard. It's really hard.
It's even harder when it's your investor at a series B or C that says you can't do this. And you're like, well, I can. I think I can. Or I think I want to. I want to grow with the company. So I think for founders out there listening to this, it's really important to have the right investors in, the ones who want to support you for the long run. Because for me, any good company takes 10 years and we all have to develop and evolve and like become better at our jobs. And as your startup scales, your job changes, because there's the kind of implicit leadership that founders have. But like, how do you define leadership for anyone in an organization?
When I think about leadership, I think it's more about influence and working across. So certainly they have to work with other people, but it's like they have to reach across the aisle. So if you are in product, customer support, if you're in engineering, all of a sudden as a leader, you have to work across much more than you've had to before. And I think that's how I think about leadership.
Yeah, that's a great way to explain it. I think there's a lot of people who, if you work long enough in startups and you kind of work your way up, if you will, everybody starts as an individual contributor, and then you might get management role, in your specific discipline. So like in my case, it's like manager of recruiting, but I don't start doing the leadership work until I'm at the sort of a director level. And then I'm going across the org and saying, how do we want to build out our teams? How are we thinking about this as a company holistically, like all the headcount together, not just I need 5 engineers, I need 3 designers, right? Like the manager mentality versus the leader mentality is quite different. How do you think about it? Well, you had mentioned earlier, like anybody can be a leader, but how do you decide for yourself if you are a manager and everybody wants the leadership title, right? The joke is like everybody wants to be a leader, but nobody wants to lead.
Truer words have never been said.
Right? But how do you decide that for yourself? Like, I want to step up, not just because I want to make more money. That's obvious, but that's too easy. It's like, I want to lead my team and I want to be a leader across the org because I think it's going to be beneficial to the company, right?
Honestly, I think a lot of it's mental prep. People always ask me like, what do I need to know and what expertise?
How would they know?
You probably have the expertise, because if you as a leader, and I see this all the time in new leaders, they go down into the technical expertise and they're like down in the dirt. It's like, that's actually the wrong place. And I can tell you stories of several CTOs, VP of engineering and other folks who were let go because they were focused on the wrong things. And, that's where you see people fail out in less than 6 months. because they're focused on the technical. And I think that's the biggest misnomer, is focusing on, am I technical enough in whatever technical can mean? Because there are technical bits, as you and I know, to recruiting, to people, to product, to everything. Are you prepared to be unpopular and to make unpopular decisions? Are you prepared for people to gossip about you and tell you that either you're incompetent or you're cruel? Are you prepared to wrestle with, how do I really collaborate with people who are very different from me? How do I work with people across the aisle when their style is so different from mine, and I want to write them off? So for me, it's a lot about, am I really willing to learn about myself? Because I think leadership is about learning yourself. If you're doing it effectively, you're learning and growing about yourself and how to work effectively with other people.
Within an organization, like, a lot of leaders become leaders because of, just career promotion. As a founder, like, it's the same question. It's like, how do I know when I'm ready to be a founder? And my answer is usually, you're not ready and you should still do it. If you don't think you're ready, then you should definitely not do it. If you need encouragement to be a founder, like, you don't do it. Like, you're not gonna make it.
I think some of it is the same. Like, one, they've been captured by some idea and they're like, I have to see it through. I want to create this thing because I want to see it exist in the world. But I think being a founder leader, there's a lot of pressure on you. Are you ready? Especially if you're going to have people, obviously you're going to be hiring people. Are you ready to be up at night wondering, like, am I going to be able to pay them? Sometimes startups fail because of the product. You know what I mean? They can't find product market fit. That happens. I think they more fail because they're not willing to have hard conversations with their co-founders. The co-founder relationship and the dynamics tank more startups than you see. So it's like, am I willing to delve into that?
Founder conflict is the number one reason that startups fail. I would like to propose that the number two is the founder themselves, right? And that's a big, big Pandora's box that we don't need to open. But you did say something earlier that I do want to touch on, which is, like, one of my favorite startups in the Valley, and nobody even thinks of it as a startup anymore, is Pixar, right? And Pixar was a really strange co-founding team, right? Amalgam of creatives and technical people. But I think one of their best movies, maybe it's just me, is Inside Out.
I love that movie.
Said, founders, right? It's such a great movie. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. But Inside Out, we're talking about, like, all these emotions within the head of a person, or in this case, the head of a founder. And starting a company is just a crazy, audacious, like, you're never going to succeed 99.99% of the time. You're going to fail, but you're going to do it anyway, right? So why do we have so many obstacles outside, obviously, product market fit and all these business obstacles? But how do we face those internal obstacles? How do we sort of prepare ourselves, if you will, to be a better founder, to be a better leader?
I mean, I've been a coach for many, many years. I'm like certified in the very early bunch many years ago. So admitting my bias. I mean, I think also therapy can help too. I honestly believe, and there's a place for therapy and coaching. I think there's an interesting one I think a lot about with founders is the idea of grit. You have to have grit in order to be a founder. But then when does that grit turn into you are grinding yourself and your co-founders or your team into the ground? How do you have the discernment between when do I keep plugging in and when is it like I need to let off the gas or I need to step away and think? You're smiling. Do you understand?
This is not a therapy session.
I think about that a lot, though. Like, how do they navigate that? Because my dad always says, when my dad was a design engineer for GM. He built prototypes and he unveiled the first electric car to the world from GM.
Whoa, wait.
From GM.
EV1?
The Electrovair 2 was the first one that was unveiled to the world. He worked on that one. He also worked on the Electro van. And he's got patents and all sorts of things like that. But what my dad always says is your assets in excess become your liability. So your assets in excess become your liabilities. And if you think about grit is an incredible asset for a founder. You have to have it. If you don't have grit, you're not going to get over rejection. You're not going to get over all those failures that are going to happen. But there's a place in which people keep going. And I know a founder who keeps going and going and going and their business is flat. And, but it's also causing them lots of harm. It's like, and I think about them, is their grit helpful for them? And I don't know, I don't know enough about their personal financial situation to understand, because I don't think everybody has to have a unicorn or a high growth startup. I don't believe that. I don't think lifestyle business is a bad word. Like if someone wants to do that, you know what I mean? If they decide like this startup isn't working, I want to move this business into something else. I have no judgment. But again, how do we just understand when are we going too far on this thing? Like grit.
Yeah. Well, I think it's good to have a co-founder in that case, because if you can be honest with each other, maybe your lines are different. And, I've had this conversation with my co-founder where his line was, let's just say 5 years. And that's totally fine. Like we worked as hard as we could. And he's like, after 5 years, it's like, we need to be making more money, right? Okay, cool. We had this discussion early and we made sure that we were aligned on like what our goals were. And I said, my line's 10 years. So like, grit, everybody has to have it. I think that's a key ingredient that very few founders talk about, which is like, yeah, you can grind it out, but you can also grind yourself to death.
Right. And it causes a lot of the things that we've talked about. But I have to say, Sorry to interrupt you. I love that you two talked about you're aligned on your goals and your expectations, because I don't know that people talk enough. Like those are hard conversations sometimes. And it's fantastic that you had it.
But I feel like as a CEO, I'm a failure if I didn't hold up my end of the bargain to get the company to a size and scale that made sense for my CTO. And we're still friends, and I'm glad that we can keep the relationship. But it's like I still feel personally responsible for not making the company successful for him. Meaning, like it wasn't successful enough for him to continue. And that's okay. But it probably took me a year to get over that, right? Like it's really hard. And as a founder, it's really hard to separate our identities and ourselves from our companies. And so there is this like endless grind because like I can't admit my company is a failure because that means I admit that I'm a failure, and I'm not. Like I've never failed. I mean, I failed a lot, but in other measures like academics or anything like that. One of the things I have my kids do is they write a daily. It's not even a journal. It's just a little flip book. It's really cute, but it has a tiny little slip of paper, and it's on a binder ring, so they have like hundreds of them. Each day, or my son does it at night, they'll write a grit and gratitude. So one side is I'm thankful for whatever for that day, something super simple. I had a good snack, or I had a treat or something, like something simple. And then the other side is like something gritty, like what did I do today that kind of increased my grit muscle, if you will, right? That made me push a little harder than I normally would. It's a little bit more difficult than usual. And like look back on those, because like you need the grit, right, to get through life, but the personal grit that you carry with you. And then the flip side is the gratitude for everything that you do have, right? Like life's not all bad, I hope, for most people. But I don't know if I'm developing the founder mentality. That's my secret goal for this is like, I think my daughter's going to build $1 billion company. She might know that.
I love that. I love all these topics. I do gratitudes and acknowledgements. Like, what am I proud of that I accomplished today that I didn't think I could do before? So I do something kind of similar that I give people who are feeling not proud of themselves or not confident. Like, write down what you did. I still do it. I still write down my weekly accomplishments and like, what am I proud of that I didn't think I could do?
I don't want to get super dark, but I do want to touch on this, which is, there's a downside to grit. There's a downside to founder psychology. We are very, very intertwined with our companies. And even from outward appearances, the company might look like it's doing well, but only you know the actual numbers, and you know the actual metrics, and you know what your growth curve looks like. And sometimes like I've had a few instances where my founder friends won't necessarily reveal that, and they shouldn't, but they don't even want to talk about it from like just a personal point of view, like a friend point of view. Well, I'm not going to name any names, of course, but like the one example is like I had a founder friend. He's raising a Series A. Everything looked great. It looked like he was going to close this huge round. The numbers looked good. He had turned his company around, but in his mind, it wasn't enough. In his mind, it was still kind of a big failure. He was like on the cusp of the next thing, but all the stress of getting to that point had been too much. And so he took his own life in his car. It's a thing that happened a while back, and no one talked about it because suicide is just a forbidden topic, especially among founders. But I know a lot of people have these stresses, and a lot of us, we go through this kind of really dark periods. How do you, A, talk to somebody before you get to that point, and B, separate yourself, your identity from your company?
I think this is exactly what we should be thinking about and talking about. And I really believe that nearly every single founder should have a therapist. You know what I mean? Because like this is a case where coaching is not an appropriate. There is a real role for people who are founding something, and let's say there's a lot of pressure, raising a series and stuff. like that's pressure. That's a lot of pressure on anybody. And there's also a lot of publicity, which then you're doing things in public. So not only are you failing, but you're failing in public, which is a whole other level that can create stress and strain that is not, I wouldn't say abnormal, but it's extra stress and strain. So I really believe almost all founders should have therapists or have gone through, honestly, or go through therapy. They need that kind of support, right? And they need real deep support systems.
Career coaching or leadership coaching versus therapy or traditional. And I was going to make a terrible joke about, founder conflict. It's kind of like marriage counseling. Sometimes you need someone like a third party to listen to both sides and kind of walk you through the issues, right? Resolve the whatever obstacles that you have in that relationship with your co-founder. But in this case, it's like as an individual, right? I think career coaching is really great. I think it's a new thing. So there's two things. One is like when I recruit people from big companies, they're like, I don't want to join a startup in case the startup doesn't succeed and that looks bad on my resume. Sure. But you can always get another job. You can always go back to the big companies if you want. And then in other countries, I know for sure in other countries, this is much more prevalent. In Silicon Valley, less so, which is like if you start a company and it doesn't succeed, that could be the end of your career. That could be it for you. You don't get many second chances. And one of the great things about the Valley is like we love second chance stories. We love a failed founder who makes a great comeback, right? Like that's just such a great storyline. You got to have the support. You have to have the resources. You have to have the money or the personal wealth, maybe married to somebody who makes a lot of money. You have to have enough of a support structure for you to bounce back, for you to fall onto the trampoline and not be fatal.
It's not just a mushy, gooey sort of thing. Those companies, if the founder is failing or the founder is struggling, that's going to have an impact on the well-being of the company and the morale of the company and financial well-being. Like if you really want to get practical about it, there's a line to profits. You know what I mean? We're not running, we're running for-profit businesses here, by and large, what we're talking about. There's a line to that.
It's kind of the same. We don't have that in our culture, meaning like it's not a thing. You have this idea of like, oh, just get through it, just tough it out. My dad was the type of person, and again, this might be therapy. But, I remember it was crazy. I was like climbing a tree, I fell off and I like landed on my back and I was like, wow, I'm really hurt. I need medical attention. And my dad's like, just get up. Yeah, just brush it off. It doesn't matter. Deal with it. And that's a hard way to grow up. And I try not to do that with my kids. I want you to be tough, but I want to know that I care. So I think saying that, A, you have to admit your company is failing. B, you have to admit that some part of that is you. And then C, you have to admit that you need help. So I think those are 3 hurdles that a lot of people have to go through. And if you don't have people saying that it's okay to do that, or you don't have a culture that's accepting of that.
I kind of want to bring up something that I've been working on. It's called leadership archetypes. And it's thinking about I've identified 6 different kinds of archetypes of leaders and the ways that we lead. And the one that you're talking about right now is what I call the hero. And the hero is like gritty. They're gritty. Oh, it's not bad. We love heroes. The hero, their middle name would be like resilience or persistence. The hero is quite a common archetype I see in founder personalities, and we need them. But their downfall is that they don't ask for help. Think about like Captain America in the Marvel movies, or like Tom Cruise in any Mission Impossible film. And so thinking about where do they need help? And then who else might they surround themselves with? So if you're a hero and you go it along, you're going to dust it off, keep going, brush it off and don't let anybody see you sweat or you don't need help. Then it's like, who else do you surround yourself with? Maybe, you need someone with a very different type of mentality, like what I call like the maestro. The maestro creates the team. They're really good at getting all the systems in your company working and the people working like a team. And they are more likely to ask for help than, let's say, my hero type would, So it's like thinking about who else do you surround yourself with, who is you're going to be able to learn and bounce off of, and who can, when you're thinking about growing those relationships and who you found a company with.
As a solo founder, you sort of have to play that role, right? Like it's pretty much the only role available. When I work with other founders, when I work on other startups, and I do still, help other companies grow, I'm totally cool playing like the maestro role, as long as it's not my company, meaning like I'm not the founder, but I'm really good at doing this, especially around building teams and building recruiting infrastructure. But I can do that for other companies.
I don't think it's weird. And it is true. Again, it goes back to, I don't want to diminish they have to be heroes. They have to go through and do that in order to found a company. It's a hard thing. So it's not to diminish it at all. It totally makes sense to me why they get to that place. I just want to help them. You know what I mean? I want to help people so that they don't get to the really hard places.
Yeah, we definitely should do everything we can to help founders before it's too late. On that note, I do want to end. And if you want to tell folks more about how they can find you, where they can read your writings.
My name's Suzan Bond, Suzanbond. You Google me and I'm like, I don't know, the first few pages. It's super easy to find once you know there's the Z in there. That's my Twitter handle, is at Suzan Bond. SuzanBond.com is the main thing. And then I have a Substack where I talk about interpersonal, organizational dynamics, and it's called Annotations and Observations. So, but you can find that it's a little more poetic. I want to do something different.
Yeah. Well, Suzan, thanks for taking the time and sharing your story. I think this is going to be a helpful episode for a lot of founders out there, a lot of leaders, a lot of people thinking about this space. We talked about your hero archetypes. I think you're obviously not a Bond villain. You're Suzan Bond, the startup star here. So I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining us today. And as always, folks, follow us on Twitter, FunBMC. This is episode 4. Hope to see you guys back here next time.
And I really believe that nearly every single founder should have a therapist. This is a case where coaching is not an appropriate. There is a real role for people who are founding something, and let's say there's a lot of pressure, raising a series and stuff. Like, that's pressure. That's a lot of pressure on anybody. And there's also a lot of publicity, which then you're doing things in public. So not only are you failing, but you're failing in public, which is a whole other level.